Hi everyone, I'm Breck DuPaul. Thank you all again for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about writing early round speeches, how I approach them, the different parts of them, and then we'll sort of look at two examples and put it all back together right at the end to sort of give you all a good foot in the door on how to approach early round speeches. So, quick introduction about who I am. I'm a senior in high school. Right now I am living and studying in France, so I'm not competing on the circuit. But last year I placed 10th in NSDA Senate Finals. I was the Durham champion. I placed third at Emory, and I am a two-time TOC Top 10 finalist. But right now, I'm working as the Congress Director at Equality in Forensics. Equality in Forensics is a great registered 501c3 nonprofit providing free educational resources to all of you. So please check out our website. You can sign up for free coaching, you can sign up for our newsletter, and so much more there. And we also have more lectures just like this posted on our YouTube. You can also feel free to email me if you have any questions about any of the content here, or if you just want to chat. And without further ado, one last note. And it's that there's no one way to do things. This is how I approach early round speeches. It's how I found success, but it's not to say that this is the only way or the correct way to approach early round speeches. Here are my tips and tricks. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt, adapt it so it meets your needs, and make it your own. There is no one way to do things in Congress. Now, why in the world would you want to really speak early or take the authorship or sponsorship position? In my mind, here are maybe the top 6 reasons, and we'll get to one more on the next slide. But it's that you are the first person speaking. You are framing the debate, laying the foundation for every other speaker that follows to build upon. That allows you to engage with or to lay the meat of the debate for the other side to engage with. You get to choose. You get to contextualize the status quo, explain the legislation how you want it explained. It creates sort of the very first exposure to the legislation that everybody else has to then debate in context of. But thirdly, this is maybe something that people forget a lot of the time. Because you're speaking early, you can write the speech before round that allows for you to refine and polish your rhetoric so you can have more clarity and be more successful in round. It leaves less things up to chance, which brings up right into our 4th point of not being reliant on others to be successful. When you're writing crystallization speeches or giving late round refutation, you're reliant on other people to make specific arguments or to make arguments that you can refute successfully. When you're speaking early and creating new points, you're not relying on other people speaking before you. So, that's reason 4. And then switching notes here, it gives you a precedence and recency bump. So then again, you don't have to worry about missing out on speaking on the next bill or the bill after that, or you and another person standing up and you not being chosen on, because if you speak early on the first bill, then you're at the top of the recency list. And then finally, at the very, very least, if you write an early round speech, you stand up, you don't get it, you have the content, you have the intro, you have the conclusion, you have everything you need to build a good mid or late round speech. It prepares you for adaptation. All right, now here's that sort of extra reason I was hinting at. In tournaments where there is a final appeal, I believe the authorship or sponsorship is the most overpowered speech in Congress, because you get the first speech of the round, you get to frame the round, you get to give a constructive, you get to develop your, the status quo, your solvency, good solid warrants, nice rhetoric, but then you can also get the last speech. You get to conclude the round, you get to refute people. That's showcasing a skill that you can't in an authorship speech. And you also get an extra minute and 30 seconds of speaking. That gives you some more face time in front of the judges. So you kind of get all of the upsides of an authorship speech with none of the downsides, because you have the same opportunities as a late round speaker. And for those of you who don't know, a final appeal does not affect your recency. So if you give an authorship and you give a final appeal, you're still at the very top of the recency list. Okay, now let's just break down some quick technicalities. The author is the person who physically wrote the bill, or in some districts, it is a person coming from the school who wrote the bill. I myself debated in Ohio, and that's sort of the rules we played by. But the sponsor is someone who stands and takes the responsibility of the author when they are either not present or when the author is not taking responsibility as the author of the bill, right? And so if somebody calls for a sponsorship, or if somebody calls for an authorship and you are not the person who wrote it or comes from that school, you can't stand. But if they call for a sponsorship or first affirmative and you're from that district, you can stand and you can take it. Just remember, if you're sponsoring a piece of legislation, it becomes your legislation. So instead of saying, like, pass this legislation, you say pass my legislation or pass my policy. And then early rounders are going to be that second, third, fourth AF or second, third, fourth neg that are developing their side by extending the impacts of solvency. And we'll break down what that means in a second here. But really, it's saying by solving the issue, like today's legislation solves this issue and creates this impact on this population. But that might be a little confusing to sort of explain abstractly, so I'll give you an example. But next, let's look at the burden of the author or the sponsor, because remember, the two have the same responsibility. Firstly, they have the duty to explain and quantify the status quo. What's the problem that's happened? Like, what's the problem in the status quo right now, and why does it deserve our attention? Typically, you can do that best with quantifiable numbers. Like if the bill you're debating that you wrote or that you're sponsoring is a bill to mandate seatbelts for school buses, then it would be best to include a statistic about why is explaining or quantifying why it's important. If you find a statistic that says 10,000 kids die each year because of school bus accidents and they weren't wearing seatbelts, use that. Say 10,000 kids die each year because they weren't wearing a seatbelt in their school bus. It's time that this issue finally gets our attention, right? Tell me why I should care. Now, secondly, explaining and proving solvency. This means explaining your legislation. Always assume that your judge has not read the legislation, or understands what it means. And then proving solvency means proving why your legislation actually solves. Now, the third bullet point here is setting the burden of proof for the neg. And this is a little bit more of an abstract topic, a little more advanced. So a burden of proof is essentially a win condition. As the author, as an early round speaker, you can say the side that wins today's debate is the side that best proves, or is the side that best protects people from poverty, right? And what that allows is for later speakers to engage with it and say, our sponsor told us the side that wins today's debate is the side that best protects people from poverty. I gave you the number that the AF protects 400,000 people from poverty, but the neg told you they only protect 100,000 people of poverty. It's on that metric that you vote in the affirmative. That's a little convoluted of an explanation, but essentially it's a win condition. But at the end of the day, if I just lost you there in that explanation, the authorship and the sponsorship must frame the round. Tell me what the problem is, tell me why it needs my attention, tell me what your legislation does, and tell me why it works. Okay, the burden of early rounders. So early rounders don't really have the same burdens of proof that the authorship or sponsorship do, because they hopefully the author or sponsor explained the legislation and explained why it worked. So what they're doing is providing buffer to the first AF or the first negation. They are extending the impacts of solvency, right? So if the author gave an impact out to poverty, right? Today's legislation lifts 40,000 or 400,000 people from poverty. The second negation might extend, or the second affirmation might extend that by saying, giving some warrant explanation point about how we're also preventing food insecurity, or how we are also, or how by, lifting people out of poverty, we're increasing production, I don't know, GDP, right? You're just creating more content on your side that the neg or that the other side has to respond to. So if you're doing that on the app, you're creating more positive content to why you passed today's legislation that the neg then has to respond to. Establishing or quantifying net harm. That's if you're on the negation, and that's just saying like today's legislation, like if you pass today's legislation, it actively makes the status quo worse. You can't say as a negation speaker that we shouldn't pass today's legislation because there's other issues that deserve our attention. You must prove that passing today's legislation actively makes the status quo worse. How you get there? Well, there's a million possibilities to do that, but it is best to quantify that. And then finally, just do whatever the author of sponsorship forgot or didn't have the time to do. So if they didn't explain Section 2A very clearly, or they left out a technicality, or you want to include a burden that they missed, do it. You can do that as an early rounder. All right. Now, let's break down sort of the structure of the authorship or sponsorship in key parts. There's really two parts. With an authorship or let's back up for a sec. With an authorship or sponsorship, organization is key. Themes, I've used them in the past because they help with it. If you have either 3 questions, like the first question in today's debate, and then give a little mini point, the second question in today's debate, or the third question, that brings us to the final question of today's debate, right? And if you frame it around the 3 questions framework, that works great for an authorship or sponsorship, or you can do something interesting, like we'll look at an example here in a second about Theodore Roosevelt framing his progressive era policy. But vanilla authorships always follow this structure. Explaining the status quo, why it's a problem, why it deserves our attention, and then solvency. Now, burdens, this is what I mentioned briefly. A burden is the win condition of the debate. A good burden has to be something that people can engage with. So, for example, the side that wins this debate is the side that best protects people from poverty. Both the AF and the neg can engage with that and prove that. The bad burden is something that the neg just simply can't prove in any world. The neg can't say that going forward, it's okay to hurt poor people, right? That's not a burden that people can actually engage with. All right, warrants. We're just going to touch briefly on this because people ask all the time or forget what are warrants. So warrants explains how your argument makes sense and why it's true or how it connects to this legislation. So typically, it'll be sometimes like in authorships or sponsorships, you'll have section warrants, and that's an explanation. Like today's legislation finally fixes the funding mechanism of public schools because, and then this is the warrant part, under Section 3A of today's legislation, public school funding is federally controlled instead of states or districts, whatever it might be. I don't know. I'm making that up. Sometimes warrants need evidence themselves. All right. So next we're going to look at 2 quick examples, a vanilla authorship and a more complicated thematic one that I used in the past, Emory finals and just a state tournament. And if you want to look at them on your own, just go to tinyurl.com/earlyround1, uppercase E, uppercase R, but typically tinyurl isn't sensitive to that stuff. All right. So now let's look at sort of the status quo quantification and explanation. This is a very, very vanilla authorship. So I had an intro right above this that sort of led into this point. I'm saying the first question that will frame this debate is, what does the status quo look like? This is me telling the judges, why should you even care? This bill is about expanding social and emotional learning. Most judges don't even know what social and emotional social and emotional learning is. And maybe that's ignorant to say, but you should always veer on the side of caution. If something might be like not common knowledge, explain it, clarify it for your judges. They're sitting through hours and hours and hours of debate. They're tired. Make their job easy for them, right? Write their ballot for them. All right, so we can see with the quantification here, Education Week Research Center in 2022 quantifies that only 29% of teachers have gone through social and emotional learning. But what exactly is this social and emotional learning for teachers? The Department of Education explains that social and emotional learning equips teachers, blah, 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 blah. This was a quick quantification and explanation of what is social and emotional learning, and we're lacking it, right? That number is telling me we're lacking social and emotional learning. But that prompts the second question. What's the problem when teachers lack social and emotional training? And so here we get right into a quantified statistic. Brookings tells us that white teachers were 9% less likely to expect a black student to earn a college degree than their black colleagues when evaluating the same student, because this lack of social and emotional learning had sort of ingrained and printed subconscious bias into teachers, and this is the problem we are trying to fix in the status quo, quantified. But now we transition into solvency. How does today's legislation combat this issue? Well, social and emotional learning helps break this pattern by teaching teachers to reflect on their racial, socioeconomic, and gender backgrounds to better understand and relate to their students. That is a logical warrant. That is explaining why today's legislation, in one sentence, solves the problem. And then a piece of data proving that. That's just all that is. And notice how all of these have numbers in them. Use as many numbers as you can. All right, continuing on the same speech. We've had the status quo quantification. What's the problem? Why does it matter? And then a very little teeny bit of beginning of solvency of how social and emotional learning solves. But now we have to explain how the legislation solves the problem and why it works. So this is the third little blurb. Now that we know that yada, 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 how does today's legislation empower SEL learning? Section warrant. I'm explaining my bill because I wrote it. Under Section 3A, we distribute $100 million for the next 5 years to create and implement social and emotional learning for teacher certifications. Okay, that's telling me what the bill does. Now, here's the most important part that everybody forgets. You need to have data explaining why it works. You can't just say throwing money at a problem will solve it. You need to prove, if you're going to say that money will solve it, that it's a funding issue. So that's what I found. I found a piece of data that said completion rates have fallen 25% over the past 10 years because of a lack of funding for the programs. So that's a speech, right? We have status quo, solvency, pretty vanilla. Here's a different sort of style. This is less vanilla. I used a President Theodore Roosevelt framed as progressive era policy under the 2 C's, conservation and consumer protection. I'm using conservation and consumer protection because I'm setting 2 metrics for the judges or for the rest of the round to be built upon, right? I predicted conservation and economics and money, like keeping, this was a carbon tax bill, so I knew people were going to talk about the impact on poverty and low-income Americans, etc. And so I set those 2 points. I framed the debate around those 2 points, conservation and consumer protection. And I did it backwards. I explained my legislation. I said my legislation takes a 3-pronged approach to protecting lives. And I explained each of the 3 sections of my bill, one by one, what the 3 actions were and why they work. After I did that, I transitioned to why is it actually important? And then there's just some data proving it's why it's important and deserves our attention. And then, of course, I switched to consumer protection, which was just sort of a second point in and of itself. So here's an example of how you can break away from the vanilla structure of status quo and solvency and still write a successful authorship. This was one of the speeches I gave in Emory Finals where I placed 3rd. All right, at the end of the day, this is where I like to take a breath. Your job as the authorship or sponsor, or as the author or sponsor, is to explain the status quo, explain the bill, explain how and why the bill solves, and frame the debate. That is framing the debate, sorry. And if you do all that, you're amazing. Like, beautiful authorship. Explain the status quo, explain why it's important, explain your bill, and explain how and why it solves. Do those things and you're done. You're great. Don't overcomplicate it. Now, we're approaching on 20 minutes, but I do want to go over some rhetorical choices because this is an important element of sponsorship speeches that can really seal the deal on a T6 finish. To me, it's frosting on a cake, right? Too much and it ruins it. You're overdoing it. But too little and your cake feels a little bare and you might not get the results that you want. And because you're writing an authorship, you before you have time to write really good rhetoric. All right. Sometimes you can connect your rhetoric to themes, like I did with that Theodore Roosevelt example, and keep it consistent throughout the speech, right? That's just one way you can incorporate rhetoric. All right, most importantly, get rid of the canned stuff. Judges who have been judging for 5, 10, 15, 20 or more years have heard democracy dies in darkness. It's written on the front page of the Washington Post, right? You have to be original, be specific, be relevant, be interesting. Get rid of the canned stuff. We're all tired of hearing it, especially your judges. So, I was bad at math, but this legislation adds up. Cut that out. That's not relevant to the legislation at all, right? It's canned. I could put that in a speech about social and emotional learning. I could put that in a speech about gun violence. I could put that in a speech about whatever, right? It's not specific. It's not unique. The chess framework, I don't know. It's just overused. That's why I would stay away from the whole checkmate. A lot of people use that with foreign policy bills. Not a recommendation. Don't do it. It's overdone. All right. Good examples of rhetoric, right? These hasty decisions turn our judiciary into the Joker, dealing out wild card decisions. This was a piece of rhetoric that I used in a speech about the Supreme Court, and I went with a whole like pulling back the curtain on XYZ, right? It's specific though. It's a play on words. Judiciary into the Joker, right? It's interesting. This is the rhetoric that can get you those 1, 2s, and 3s. Here's another piece of rhetoric that I use. It's like, when rioters were 6 feet from our doors, their trust in us was 6 feet under. This was a bill about election security and like campaign financing, and it's topical to the legislation. Everybody remembers January 6th. It's pulling at the pathos of the judge, of the listener, right? That's examples of good rhetoric. Where can you find good rhetoric? People ask me this all the time, right? Don't doubt yourself. You're smarter than you think. Think first. Use your head. Don't default to looking elsewhere. You can make plays on words, like developing parallels and breaking them. People will do things with like using the same letter, using like drawing a parallel is what I'm trying to explain. But you can also look to speeches and not other people's Congress speeches. Please don't steal other people's rhetoric. That's not very academic. That's kind of disingenuous. But for example, presidential campaign speeches. I was looking at a speech from 1962, JFK's speech at Rice University in Texas. And I think it's in Texas. Yes. Don't fact check me. And you can use that to set up frameworks like I did, like Theodore Roosevelt's 3 C's, or 2, in reality it was 3 C's. 3 C's, or, Teddy Roosevelt framed his foreign policy under the motto, speak softly and carry a big stick. It's on that, like, 100 years later, yada, 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 right? Like, use quotes that are famous. Use quotes and bars that really pull at the heartstrings. You can find great ones in presidential speeches. And then finally, let's bring it all together with a example from House Finals 2 years ago. This was Representative Alakwa speaking on a bill to aid the Northern Triangle through CARSI, which is a regional security initiative.
For centuries, this Congress has prided itself as being able to bring the gavel of peace and prosperity to the most underserved across the world. We uphold lives, ensure that economies are stabilized, and make sure that people can live fruitful lives. When it comes to today's piece of legislation, to renew our promise to the people of the Northern Triangle, I implore you all to pass. Principally, I want you to pass this legislation to improve the quality of life in the Northern Triangle. Let's characterize the problem in the status quo that is driving our dire necessitation to pass this legislation.
This is him transitioning into that first part of the authorship we talked about, contextualizing the status quo. What is the problem? Why do we need to solve it?
Violence in the region is sky high. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies explains, in April of 2023, the Northern Triangle has some of the highest crime rates in the world, primarily due to gangs which run free across the country. But what is the biggest reason why these gangs exist in the first place? As the United Nations Office on the Coordination of Human Affairs explains, in March of 2018, almost 60% of individuals in the Northern Triangle currently live in poverty, leaving people to rely on gangs to support their daily livelihoods, which have almost 95% rates of impunity in the legal system. But how does my legislation specifically change this issue for the better? Section 1A of today's legislation invests $25 billion in the Central American Regional Security Initiative, and another $25
Now we're transitioning into the solvency of his legislation. He's explaining the specific actions his legislation takes, literally reading from the legislation what is it actually doing, and then he's going to explain, well, how does that actually solve the problem?
Will be allocated directly to foreign direct investment, which can benefit countries across the Northern Triangle. Why is that so beneficial? As the United States of Michigan finds, in University of 2020, Carsey involvement in the past from the United States in the region has dropped homicide rates by 54%. Representatives understand that by passing today's legislation, we can create a cooling effect of the violence that has gripped the lives of so many people across the region. That leaves us with two critical impacts. First off, you increase economic stability in the region. As the Atlantic Council explains, in March of 2021, investing in the private sector of the Northern Triangle is crucial to formalizing over 60% of the economy, which is currently employed in informal, low-quality, and highly unstable jobs across the region.
Now he's transitioned into extending the impacts of what are the tangible outcomes of an affirmative ballot. This is when we talk about developing impacts or really fleshing them out with numbers. That's what he's doing here.
Today's legislation specifically does that, allowing us to finally allow millions of Northern Triangle civilians to have access to economic opportunity, which they previously never did. But second, you reduce the displacement of individuals in the Northern Triangle that are currently fleeing to the north. As the United States Global Leadership Coalition explains, in April of 2021, studies have found a striking correlation that for every 10 murders in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, 6 children attempt to seek safety in the United States of America. Today's legislation finally allows children in the Northern Triangle to have to stop fleeing their homeland due to violence, increasing the benefits brought to their economy, and making sure that countless lives can be saved in the process. Strike down the gavel of peace and prosperity for the people.
For the people of the Northern Triangle and pass. It cuts out a little early in the end. Sorry about that. But I just want to transition and say thank you all. This is going to conclude our presentation for today. I'm Breck DuPaul. I'm the Congress Director at EIF, and please, if you want to see more resources like this, check us out on our website. We have signups for free Congress coaching, extemp coaching. We have a weekly newsletter. We have YouTube lectures posted. We have round analyses posted as well. So please check us out and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you all.